China Dialogue, 19th of June 2023, what part will China play in the Paris meeting to create a new global financial agreement? China has been making empty promises to achieve green goals while acting differently. According to analysts speaking to China Dialogue, China might be a key player at the following International Finance Summit to assist developing nations in addressing several challenges, including climate change. On June 22 and 23, a conference will occur in Paris to create a new global financial agreement. The French hosts want to see the global financial system reformed so that developing nations can more effectively address the issues of climate change and sustainable development. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, a set of 17 objectives established by all United Nations member states in 2015, are struggling to be met by the over 70 nations currently experiencing debt crises, many of which are also on the front lines of extreme weather occurrences. Upending the established order following the G20 meeting in Indonesia and the COP27 climate conference in Egypt, French President Emmanuel Macron first floated the idea for the summit in November of last year. At both events, there were loud appeals for nations to band together and reorient international financial institutions' support for low-income and vulnerable countries. Many people believe that in light of the so-called polycrisis, including COVID-19, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, energy supply, and currency inflation, which has compounded effects on countries, the current system could no longer assist these nations in developing their communities and economy. The event is expected to draw more than 100 heads of state and government, including Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, who played a crucial role in getting financial reform on the climate change agenda, Ali Bongo Ondimba, the President of Gabon, and Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Commission. In April, a Sino-French joint statement issued during Macron's official visit to China confirmed China's participation. Furthermore, it indicated its portrayal will be at a high level. The President of China, Xi Jinping, may visit Paris, but that is not yet certain. The Bridgetown Initiative, an action plan introduced by Mottley at COP27, is expanded upon at the summit. It calls for revising international monetary agreements based on a system established 80 years ago. The reform of multilateral development banks, MDBs, is one area of emphasis. These organizations, like the World Bank, give governments longer-term, cheaper financing for initiatives like roads, trains, and bridges that the private sector would not support. According to Kevin Gallagher, director of the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, the MDBs aren't large enough to meet needs at the moment. Additionally, according to Gallagher, such policies are not consistent with green and inclusive development. The fact that voices and representation of the developing countries are small relative to the Western powers that do not borrow is a third issue, he adds. At COP27, Mottley brought up another issue: the global North borrows at interest rates between 1 and 4%, the South International accounts for 14%. We then question why energy collaboration projects fail. High inflation also means that borrowing is becoming more expensive. These topics were highlighted in April at the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, IMF, spring meetings. The IMF is a UN organization that keeps tabs on the development of the world economy and the international financial system. This year, to strengthen the World Bank's response to climate change and other issues, the steering committee of the organization and U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen both called for additional reforms. Too much debt, not enough money for the environment. According to Kevin Moe, principal of the Institute for Global Decarbonization Progress, IGDP, a green consultancy with offices in China and Europe, the Paris meeting has a clear objective: to reach an agreement on debt restructuring and climate finance. The former entails modifying loan terms to make them simpler to repay. The main sticking point in international climate negotiations for over a decade has been the scarcity of climate money. The fundamental issue is that rich nations, historically the largest polluters of greenhouse gases, have not kept their promise to provide developing countries with $100 billion in climate money year by 2020. The funds were intended to assist the latter in reducing emissions and preparing for the effects of climate change. At the climate talks in Egypt last year, developed nations came under pressure to create a separate loss and damage fund to aid vulnerable countries in coping with the irreversible effects of climate change, such as rising sea levels. However, which countries will contribute and how much money will be available is still unknown. A financial problem began to grow among developing countries after COVID-19, hindering their attempts to reach net zero and the lack of adequate climate money. A crucial issue is that excessive borrowing is not the cause of the debt growth in African nations. According to Jade Scarf, an analyst with Development Reimagined, a development consultancy with offices in China and Africa, it is expanding due to rising interest rates. To curb inflation brought on by COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine, financial institutions worldwide have raised their interest rates. As a result, debt in developing nations increased as well. Because the debt-ridden nations are frequently most vulnerable to climate change, the debt crisis is closely related to the global effort to combat it. Such countries include Zambia and Sri Lanka. Both have defaulted, making obtaining loans more difficult and expensive if a calamity strikes. Pakistan is another illustration. Floods this summer ravaged the already heavily indebted country, causing more than $10 billion in damage and putting it on the verge of default. Countries with debt problems have less money for decarbonization, adaptation, and other climate change responses. For instance, Nigeria had to spend 96% of every tax dollar on debt payments after experiencing its worst floods in decades the previous year. China plays a huge role. Creditor countries and multilateral lenders have been looking for methods to restructure the hundreds of billions of dollars in debt that developing nations owe under the G20's Common Framework for Debt Treatment for about 2 years. But the discussions have reached a deadlock. As one of the largest economies in the world and the primary bilateral lender to poor nations, China has a huge role to play at the Paris conference, according to Martin Kessler, executive director of the Paris-based think tank Finance for Development Lab. According to Kessler, there is a significant difference between the Chinese perspective and that of the Paris Club, an informal organization of creditor nations founded in 1956 and tasked with finding practical solutions to the payment issues encountered by debtor states. The majority of Paris Club members are wealthy nations in the global north. The US and other Western countries are putting more pressure on China to lower the amount of money that some of its debtors owe. China, however, is adamant that the MDBs and other lenders should also provide debt relief and restructuring. This goes against conventional wisdom in Western capitals that the MDBs should be spared from debt relief criteria to keep their top credit rating. They must provide concessional loans to development projects on more human conditions than market loans. Kessler asks, how can China join the club to improve the shared framework for debt restructuring? Some experts emphasize the need to acknowledge differences and build a consensus. According to Kevin Movig, China manages loans in a manner that differs from the conventional practices followed by members of the Paris Club, including its lending models and classification of governmental and commercial debt. In his opinion, the talks between China, the Paris Club, and private sector creditors constitute a process of reaching a new consensus on debt management. According to Mo, China's intention to send high-level representatives to the Paris conference indicates that it is open to discussing debt restructuring. The G20 summit in India in September and COP28 in Dubai in November and December could gain pace, he continues, provided various parties can reach some consensus and accomplish quick wins on climate financing and debt restructuring in Paris. Regarding constructive collaboration opportunities, Kessler emphasizes one specific way that China can help. IMF-issued special drawing rights, SDR, is a class of reserve assets. The IMF distributed $650 billion of these assets to its member countries in 2021 to aid their pandemic recovery. African nations, however, only received $33 billion, or 5% of the total, because of the quota system, which is based on the size of a country's economy. Later that year, China declared that it was ready to allocate $10 billion, or one-fourth of its allotment, of the SDR to African nations to boost their economic recovery. In particular, the rechanneling of the SDR, Kessler sees a lot of chances for constructive collaboration between China and other partners. To ensure that these funds go to Africa, it is suggested in a recent paper co-published by his organization, and Development Reimagined, that China reroutes the $10 billion through the African Development Bank rather than the IMF. According to Gallagher of Boston University, China can keep pushing for legislation to address the problems with the MDBs in Paris. He adds that China can also establish its institutions to provide developing nations with more options and the MDBs a better model by advocating for increasing the paid-in capital of the MDBs, shifting the policies toward infrastructure and industry, and pushing for more voice for the poor. As Gallagher knows, China has had a strong role in the summit. In addition to being there, China has also organized a follow-up meeting to ensure that the decisions made at the conference are carried out, he said. According to some Chinese academics, China can contribute by increasing its green investment in other developing nations, particularly by utilizing the resources of the public and private sectors in China and the recipient countries. This is particularly relevant to the growth of renewable energy, a sector in which Chinese private enterprises are world leaders. The International Institute of Green Finance's Director General, Professor Wang Yao, emphasizes China's important role in advancing green finance internationally. She explicitly emphasizes the summit's significance and the mention of climate cooperation in the Sino-French joint statement. According to Wang, the messages fully demonstrate the two countries' determination and willingness to cooperate to assist developing and emerging economies with their financial challenges, motivate them to accelerate their energy transition, and promote sustainable development. She continues by saying that through international collaboration and exchanges, China can assist in setting global standards for green financing by sharing its experience with other developing nations.